This is the first seminar of the term organized by the European Political Economy Project of the European Studies Centre at St. Antony's College, Oxford. But it follows on from our conference last year of the political economy of climate change policies, and is part of a series of related seminars on these topics. Let me start with a little housekeeping. We'll have presentations by our speakers and then questions and answers. The presentations will be recorded, but not the Q&A. If you have questions, please enter them into the Q&A listing on the side, but it's possible that we may switch you on to ask your question directly, or if there's several related questions, I will summarize them and direct them to the panelists in a sort of way. Also, eventually the podcast and the blog of the seminar will be made available on the European Political Economy Project page of St. Antony's, where you can also see blogs and postings from past seminars and related themes of interest. So today's topic of carbon pricing is indeed very topical, very important. It is central to how the world is going to approach achieving a sustainable carbon neutral economy before any more disastrous climate change occurs. There are a host of issues involved: technological issues, technical issues, microeconomic, distributional issues, both within countries, across countries, and over time. So in many ways, an intensely political issue. There are proposals out there, notably will be discussed here, about a minimum carbon price floor agreed to by many countries, also perhaps cross-border tax adjustment to go to price carbon somehow or another. But these are complicated themes, requires a multidisciplinary approach, and one which takes both account both political interests and also the longer-term global interests, where Europe plays a major role. I'm very pleased that we have such distinguished speakers with great expertise and experience in this area. First, we'll have Parry, who's currently Principal Environmental Fiscal Policy Expert at the IMF, been working a lot on the fund's proposals in this area, but also on individual country level analysis of carbon pricing and related themes and how the carbon pricing relates to the other policies. Before joining the fund in 2010, he was a fellow, also a chair at the Resources for the Future. Then we'll have a presentation by Mehling, who's now Deputy Director of the MIT Center for Energy, Environment and Policy Research. He's also a professor at the University of Strathclyde Law School. And he's had other positions, and he's on various chairs and board positions he occupies, and also providing advisory work to government, importantly. And as discussant, we have Franziska Funke, who was until recently a visiting researcher at the Institute for New Economic Thinking and the Martin School in Oxford, and is now, as I understand it, joined the Technische Universität in Berlin as an associate researcher and doctoral candidate. And she's done research related to climate policy analysis, distribution impacts, and also climate policy issues linked to agriculture. With that, I think we can pass on to our first speaker. Ian, over to you.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'll talk about fiscal policies for climate mitigation. So the last window of opportunity for keeping alive the possibility of containing global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius, which is the central goal of the Paris Agreement, it's about to close, unless global greenhouse gas emissions are cut by 30 to 60% below currently projected levels for 2030. The Paris Agreement is working in the sense that 195 parties have signed the agreement, And many are now submitting zero emission pledges for mid-century. But by itself, the Paris Agreement is insufficient. Even if countries fully achieved the mitigation pledges they've made for 2030, that would only achieve about half of the global emissions reductions that are needed, even for the 2 degrees Celsius target. And there's no mechanism for ensuring that even these pledges will be achieved. So we need to complement and reinforce the Paris Agreement with another international mechanism, which I'll come back to at the end. We think that carbon pricing, that is charges on the carbon content of fossil fuels or their emissions, has a central role in all countries' mitigation strategy. As the carbon charges are passed forward in higher prices for fossil fuels, electricity, and so on, that's going to provide across-the-board incentives to reduce energy use and shift towards cleaner fuels. Carbon pricing is cost-effective in the sense that it equates the cost of the last ton reduced across different sectors. It provides the price signal that's really essential for redirecting new investment towards low-emission technologies. Carbon pricing raises a valuable source of new revenue. It generates significant domestic environmental co-benefits like reductions in local air pollution deaths. And it can be straightforward from an administrative perspective. But getting the basic design details right is very important. Ideally, we want to cover emissions from the power sector, industrial sector, transportation sector, and the building sector. Ideally, we want a carbon price that's predictable and progressively rises over time to mobilize the private sector investments in low emission technologies. And ideally, we want to use most of the revenues productively in a way that boosts the economy. For example, using the revenues to lower taxes on investment and work effort, or using them to fund productive investments for sustainable development goals. Carbon taxes on the carbon content of fossil fuels are a natural carbon pricing instrument. They can provide certainty over future emissions prices. The revenues accrue directly to the Ministry of Finance, and carbon taxes can easily build off existing fuel taxes, which are well established in most countries. So all we have in mind is integrating carbon charges into existing gasoline and diesel taxes, and then applying similar charges to other petroleum products, coal, and natural gas. Emissions trading systems, where firms are required to hold allowances to cover their emissions, and the government controls the total supply of allowances. These can provide similar benefits to carbon taxes if they include price stability mechanisms like price floors, and if the allowances are auctioned to raise government revenue. But to date, often emissions trading systems have been limited to the power and industry sector, and they're not a practical option for some countries, for example, countries with limited institutional capacity. We are seeing momentum for carbon pricing across the world. There are now over 60 carbon pricing schemes at regional, national, and subnational level. Just this year, we've seen major carbon pricing initiatives launched in China and Germany. Canada has just announced that its emissions price is going to rise to $170 per ton by 2030. And we've seen that emissions prices in the European trading system, which covers the power and industry sector, have just risen to above 40 euros per ton. Carbon pricing would have a dramatic impact on the price of coal. For example, a $50 per ton carbon price in 2030 increases coal prices on average across G20 countries by about 150%. But coal is largely an intermediate product rather than a product that's consumed at the household level. And the impacts of carbon pricing on products that are consumed at the household level, while significant, are not as dramatic as the impacts on coal prices. For example, a $50 per ton carbon price on average increases the prices of natural gas across G20 countries by about 50%, increases the price of electricity about 35% on average, and increases retail gasoline prices by 11%. In this figure, the red dots are showing the percentage reduction in fossil fuel CO2 emissions below baseline levels in 2030 that are needed to meet countries' current mitigation pledges for 2030. And the blue bars are indicating the percentage reduction in fossil fuel emissions that would be induced by carbon prices of $25, $50, and $75 per ton in 2030. So as we can see, some countries are going to need carbon prices or equivalent measures of around $75 per ton or more, for example, Canada, Korea, European countries, while in other cases, carbon prices of well below $25 per ton will be sufficient, for example, in China, India, Russia, and South Africa. And this wide dispersion in the emissions prices that are implicit in countries' mitigation pledges reflects not only differences in the stringency of those pledges across countries, indicated by differences in the red squares, but also differences in the responsiveness of emissions to prices, indicated by differences in the blue bars. For example, emissions are a lot more responsive to pricing in countries that consume a lot of coal, like China, India, and South Africa. Carbon pricing could mobilize substantial amounts of revenue. For example, a $50 per ton carbon price in 2030 would be mobilizing revenues of about 0.5 up to 3% of GDP across different G20 countries. In this figure, the red bars are the economic efficiency costs of a $50 per ton carbon price in 2030. So that's the value of foregone benefits to fossil fuel consumers, less the savings in supply costs. That's the standard way economists measure the economic costs of carbon pricing. And these costs are really not that large, around 0.5% of GDP for emissions intensive countries like China, India, and South Africa, and significantly below that in other cases. But the blue diamonds here are the domestic environmental co-benefits of carbon pricing, the reductions in local air pollution deaths, reductions in traffic congestion and accident externalities, minus the pure economic efficiency costs. And these net benefits are typically around zero or slightly positive in most cases, and substantially positive, 2% of GDP or more in China, India, and Russia, where there would be very large local air pollution benefits from scaling back fossil fuel consumption. So we think that many G20 countries can move ahead unilaterally with carbon pricing, and up to a point make themselves better off before even counting the global climate change benefits. Now, we think that carbon pricing should be the centerpiece of countries' mitigation strategy, but it needs to be supported by a variety of other measures to enhance the overall effectiveness and political acceptability of a comprehensive mitigation strategy. This includes reinforcing carbon pricing with measures at the sectoral level, like regulations and feebates, which I'll explain in a minute. It also means investing in public investments in the clean technology infrastructure that would not be provided by the private sector, electric vehicle charging stations, extensions of the power grid to link up renewable sites, and so on. As we said, the carbon pricing revenues should be recycled in a way that benefits the economy, but in a way that's also equitable, with benefits accruing to all households. We need just transition measures, meaning assistance for vulnerable workers, vulnerable regions, and to protect low-income households. We need measures to provide reassurance against losses in industrial competitiveness. And we need pricing of broader emissions sources, like from forestry, agriculture, methane leaks from extractive industries. So I think that there's a balance that countries need to strike between carbon pricing, which is the most efficient policy, and reinforcing measures at the sectoral level, which are not as efficient as carbon pricing, but may have greater political acceptability because they avoid a significant increase in energy prices. And here, we generally recommend the use of feebates rather than regulations, although feebates are just the fiscal analog of regulations. Feebates provide a sliding scale, a revenue neutral sliding scale of fees on products or activities with above average emission rates, and a sliding scale of rebates for products or activities with below average emission rates. They have a number of attractions. First of all, they can promote all of the potential behavioral responses within a particular sector for reducing the emissions intensity of that sector. But they don't promote the same demand response as carbon pricing. For example, in the vehicle sector, feebates will reduce vehicle emission rates, but they won't encourage people to drive less. Secondly, feebates are automatically cost effective, whereas for regulations to be cost effective requires extensive credit trading provisions across firms. Thirdly, feebates update automatically to maintain revenue neutrality, so they don't impose a new fiscal cost on the government, unlike clean technology subsidies. In addition, feebates do not impose a new tax burden on the average household or firm, unlike carbon pricing, because they don't involve the pass-through of carbon tax revenue or allowance rents in higher energy prices. So that can help with their political acceptability. And feebates are compatible with existing regulations. In fact, they provide an ongoing incentive for firms to always exceed any standards. Feebates could be applied to the vehicle sector to alter the relative price of clean and dirty vehicles and promote penetration of electric vehicles. They could be applied to reinforce incentives in the power and industry sector for firms to reduce their emissions rates per unit of production without a significant increase in electricity prices or prices of industrial products. It could be applied to the vehicle sector, for example, to promote the penetration of energy efficient appliances or clean heating systems, or they might be integrated into existing property tax systems to reward people for refurbishing their houses to move on to a higher energy performance certificate. It could also be applied to the forestry sector, where landowners would be charged over time if they're reducing carbon storage on their land, and landowners receive a subsidy if they're increasing carbon storage on their land over time. And that would promote all of the potential behavioral responses for increasing forest carbon storage, afforestation, reducing deforestation, changes in forest management to sequester more carbon. So just finally, we think that at the international level, policymakers should consider the possibility of an international carbon price floor arrangement to complement and reinforce the Paris Agreement. Under the Paris Agreement, it's just difficult for parties to negotiate more ambitious short-term emissions targets because there are 195 parties signatories to the agreement. In addition, when countries act unilaterally, it can just be very difficult for them to scale up their mitigation policy due to concerns about competitiveness impacts or free riding the risk that other trading partners may renege on their mitigation pledges. For an international price floor proposal, it has two key elements. First is a focus on the large emitting countries. For example, China, India, and the United States account for 57% of projected global emissions in 2030. Other potential participants might include the EU and other G20 countries that already have robust carbon pricing in place, like Canada, Korea, and the United Kingdom. And the second key element would be a focus on a minimum carbon price, because that's efficient an easily understood parameter. Simultaneous action to scale up carbon pricing amongst the large emitting countries would be the most effective way to address concerns about competitiveness and free riding. This arrangement could be designed equitably with stricter price floors for wealthier countries and/or simple, transparent transfer mechanisms to help lower income participants. And it could be designed flexibly to accommodate countries where carbon pricing is just politically very difficult, so long as their alternative approaches yielded emissions outcomes that are equivalent to implementing the price floor. And it's striking how effective the carbon price floor would be. For example, if the United States, China, and India were subject to price floors of $75, $50, and $25 per ton, respectively, in 2030, and other G20 countries implemented their mitigation pledges, that would be sufficient to cut G20 emissions to 29% below baseline levels, which is almost in line with what would be consistent with the 2 degrees Celsius target. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Ian. Thanks so much. And that's a great overview of the issues, and also one particular proposal, the effectiveness of the carbon tax and this notion of an international carbon tax floor. Let me now pass over to Michael for his presentation.
Thank you, Daniel, and thanks for the invitation to participate here. It's, of course, a pleasure to speak on this timely topic at such a great university. I'm going to share my screen. I have some slides as well. Tell me if it's not showing correctly, but I think we tested it before, so it should be working. I'll have to rush through a number of slides. I will keep my description of each slide relatively short, but I thought it's still good to have the material in there in case in the discussion, for instance, we want to dive a little bit deeper. And I want to specifically pick up a point that Ian just mentioned, namely the concerns about unilateral action around carbon pricing and really about any constraining type of climate policy that imposes costs on producers, on citizens, etc., but specifically on producers, and how to deal with the competitiveness concerns around that. And one instrument that has been discussed for many years, but only now is starting to gain some momentum, are border adjustments for carbon. The EU and specifically is advancing this right now and is expected to propose a border carbon adjustment mechanism in July. And I'll describe a little bit how it came, for how the political context changed in order to facilitate this debate to advance the policy instrument, which is very controversial and also incurs certain risks. And I'll also go through some of the design challenges that the European Commission, which is authoring this legislative proposal, is currently considering, including WTO law considerations, and finally, a bit of an outlook whether or not this approach might expand further as selected countries, as some countries take a leadership role on carbon pricing and on other carbon constraints and face those challenges that Ian mentioned. And it kind of also goes nicely into a question that I've seen in the Q&A. Dr. Charles Enoch precisely asked, how do we deal with emissions that are embedded in products coming from other countries? Because typically carbon pricing, as implemented in most countries currently, is applied to territorial emissions. In fact, the entire accounting system or principle of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is predicated on only counting those emissions that occur within the territory of a party, meaning a country that's a member to that regime, towards the inventory of that country. But you see here that international trade complicates the picture, in that some countries, of course, are net exporters of products, including carbon-intensive products, and others are net importers. And in particular, as you can see, China exports probably about 25 to 30% of the emissions that it generates within China are linked to exported products that are then sold to other countries. If you had a way to magnify and blow up the map of Europe, for instance, you would also see that countries such as Switzerland or Sweden, in fact, have been able to reduce their own domestic emissions so far that they now actually import products that are responsible for more emissions than they emit territorially. And so this has prompted many policymakers to say, well, we cannot solve climate change by outsourcing our dirty production. That's a little bit of, let's say, abbreviating and simplifying the situation. The reason that we have such differences in some countries importing and some exporting carbon-intensive goods are, at least to date now, have very little to do with climate policies. It's primarily things such as fiscal policies, workforce, labor costs, energy and input costs, infrastructure, all those factors that under globalization have resulted in shifting production patterns around the world. Going forward, now in the past, there's been very little empirical evidence that carbon pricing and other policies that impose a cost on emissions have sort of promoted this outsourcing of production. But going forward, as carbon price levels and the ambition of other policies are expected to increase a lot to achieve decarbonization within the tight timelines that we face under the Paris Agreement, there is expectation that carbon cost will feature into the equation that results in production decisions, investment decisions being made and leading to such offshoring or outsourcing. And that precisely is why we're also discussing instruments that help avert just relocating dirty production and exporting, so to speak, the production, but re-importing the goods without having the territorial emissions, which is often described as the carbon loophole. So very quickly, these border adjustments, well, they try to avoid that. That's called leakage. When you have policies, climate policy in one jurisdiction, essentially only relocating partly or entirely the emissions to other jurisdictions with little net effect on emissions globally, and yet a cost on the implementing jurisdiction that implements the policies. Trying to level the playing field in competitive markets is the first aim of a border carbon adjustment so that you don't have these relocation effects. But there's also a desire to sort of incentivize other countries. And this is especially in the political debate often being sort of heralded as an important objective to tell other countries, listen, we will no longer import your products, your dirty products, unless you start implementing climate policies, or if anything else, you'll have to pay at the border when you import them, when you export them to us, when we import those products. There's different ways one can implement it. The most straightforward, combined, say, with a carbon tax, such as what Ian was describing, would be some sort of border tax or tariff, another fiscal measure applied at the border to imported goods, exactly what Dr. Enoch was mentioning in the Q&A. But there's also other, of course, as Ian mentioned, we have some systems that have chosen an emissions trading system to implement carbon pricing. And it's a little bit more complicated how you mirror that at the border, but it's doable by extending the obligations under the ETS, under the emissions trading system, to imports. And there's also a discussion of doing the same for exports. So in traditional border tax adjustments for, say, sales taxes or VAT, this has been very common. As countries import goods, they apply the sales tax to those imported goods, just as they do to the domestically produced goods. And as they export those goods, they rebate or provide relief for the sales tax. And it's using that same logic to carbon intensive goods. There's very different terminologies: border carbon adjustment, border tax adjustment, carbon border adjustment, carbon border tax, and indeed carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is what the EU is currently elaborating. And I'll quickly sort of take us a bit through this discussion. So for over a decade, this idea of protecting European industry, preventing leakage of emissions through the trade channels that I mentioned, could be done with an adjustment at the border. But it was always seen as a very risky and sensitive thing to do. For one, because trade relations, the EU, of course, relies on exports. Countries like Germany, member states like Germany in particular, they do not want to disrupt their trade relations and the good relationships with trade partners that import German cars, etc. We also, up until 2015, did not have sort of an open-ended and finalized international climate regime. The Paris Agreement is the first one, in addition to the UN Framework Convention, but that's a very basic sort of procedural and principle-based convention. It's the first one that really has meat on the bones and is open-ended. Since 2015, we have this regime, but before that, we didn't. The Kyoto Protocol was time-limited with its commitment periods. The Copenhagen Accord was sort of, so there was this concern that if we discuss controversial unilateral trade-related measures, it would disrupt the climate negotiations and make countries, leave the table, accusing the EU, for instance, of being protectionist and using green arguments to advance protectionist agendas. But this all changed after more than a decade of the European Commission in particular being very skeptical and pointing to the legal risk, WTO, etc. In 2019, when the old commission under Barroso was ending their term and a new commission was being considered for election, one of the candidates for the presidency, Ursula von der Leyen of the European Commission, she, the politics are a bit complex, but she felt she needed the support of the Greens in the European Parliament and also of the French President Emmanuel Macron. And both the French and many parliamentarians had endorsed this idea many times. And so suddenly in her political guidelines in 2019, you see very prominently this idea of a carbon border tax to protect European industry as the EU embarks on its European Green Deal. And things went very quickly from then. So a European Green Deal communication kept mentioning it and even mentioned when a proposal would come out. The European Council endorsed it. There was an inception impact assessment with consultations. The European Commission started mentioning what kind of revenue could be expected and how that could contribute to the EU's own resources and help pay back the next generation EU recovery plan. Some member states were pushing for it to be implemented as soon as possible. So the Council endorsed doing so by 2023, which is a very tight timeline. The European Parliament has endorsed it and added a few expectations of its own. The public consultations generally showed, with 600 plus reactions, support for it, although some concerns as well. And finally, by July this year, as part of a package of over 13 different measures, we're expecting a legislative proposal in late June or early July from the European Commission to implement the European Green Deal, which is a much, much bigger package to decarbonize the European continent, protect biodiversity, make agriculture more sustainable, and so on and so forth. So that's where we are right now. And I'll quickly tell you sort of, but again, I have to condense it, some of the big design issues that have to be dealt with. First of all, the European Commission has to think about, will it only apply to imports, products entering the EU, or should we also have some form of rebate for exports? Because indeed, goods that are traded, that are sold, European goods that are sold in global markets, if they have no other safeguard and this carbon border adjustment mechanism does not apply to exports with a rebate, then they would be potentially exposed to leakage, and it would mean a shift in production in these third markets, in the global market, to other producers from other countries, which could be also an environmental problem if we assume that foreign production tends to be more carbon intensive than European production. The question of the policy mechanism I already mentioned. There's a lot of expectation that it will be an extension of the EU ETS and not a new tax or customs duty. The question of which countries should be included. Should one exempt, for instance, least developed countries? They contribute little to emissions, and there would also be equity issues to include them, could be considered hardship. The sectoral scope is a very difficult decision. Which products will be included, which will be excluded, and how far down the value chain do you go? Is it just upstream steel and cement, which are among the most energy intensive and thus carbon intensive and carbon cost sensitive sectors? Or do you also go down to, say, certain semi-finished and finished goods all the way down, for instance, to cars? So there's a discussion where exactly to put that threshold. And of course, it gets infinitesimally more complex the further down you go in the value chain. Which emissions will be covered, only direct emissions or also emissions associated with electricity consumed by the producers of goods, is another more technical question, but one that is being discussed. And then the big one, people used to always say, holding up their iPhone, how could we ever find out what the emissions are that are embedded or underlying this iPhone? That's not being suggested, of course. First of all, we're probably never going to go that far down the value chain to very complex manufactured consumer goods. But even if you are further upstream, say, rolled steel products, aluminum ingots, etc., you don't really know how it was produced in a foreign country, and you don't have the inspection capacity to go and look exactly what happened there. So there's two ways to do it. You can either mandate the importers to provide reported, verified emissions reports to demonstrate how carbon intensive it was, or you can apply some kind of default value, some kind of benchmark, and just say, the EU assumes that all products entering the EU are as carbon intensive as the average global producer, for instance, or the average EU producer for that matter. And if they want to, they can prove with their own documentation that they are cleaner, but it has to be independently verified. Those are some of the options that are being considered. Then when you calculate the adjustment, the idea is that you apply the carbon price that you impose on your domestic producers to the importers. But what if the importers, if the products produced in foreign countries already faced a carbon price or some other climate policy cost? Do you take that into account? Do you credit that? In theory, you should, for fairness reasons, but also WTO law, for instance, says that one probably has to subtract that price. But it's very difficult to calculate sometimes. Even carbon pricing schemes can be very different in scope, coverage, free allocation or not, and things like that. But imagine if you go beyond explicit carbon pricing to performance standards or energy efficiency standards, where you can back out an implicit carbon price and average that out. But again, methodologically, it's not easy. The IMF, OECD, and others have done calculations to that extent. You can use CGE models, for instance, to sort of get a sectoral average carbon price. But again, this is all happening in a political environment, and there'll probably be much debate. Then, of course, what to do with the revenue. If it ends up being billions, like the Commission predicted, 5 to 14 billion, that too will be very political. Should it stay within the EU and feed into its budget? Should it be reinvested into green technology innovation and deployment projects, for instance, in the EU, or maybe even in the countries that are essentially paying the border adjustment when they sell goods to the EU? Or should it go into climate finance for developing countries, which of course developing countries might not be so happy about if it is replacing the climate finance that wealthy countries are already pledged to contribute. So it would have to be additional, most likely. And then there's questions about the institutions and process. Now, I'll very quickly mention, to dive a lot deeper, one can go through each of these elements and look at all the different options and weigh them according to sort of multiple criteria: environmental, competitiveness, legal, political, technical, feasibility. And you can also look very deeply into different sectors. We've done that, I with some colleagues at the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. And I have a link on the last slide to one of these reports, if there is indeed interest in going that deep, just to give you a sense of sort of some of the work there. But I think to summarize, I think I'll finish with this slide. There's a bit more material I had, but I don't want to eat up more time of the discussion. The big challenges that one faces when one really looks deeply into this instrument, which in theory, like carbon pricing too, looks simple, elegant, and straightforward and makes a lot of sense. As you think more about its implementation, its political ramifications, the technical and administrative complexity, the legal risk, it gets very, very complex and very challenging very quickly. And one thing that I think is absolutely clear is that it's really hard to design one carbon border adjustment that is uniquely suited to all sectors. They're very different sectors, very heterogeneous in so many different ways: trade flows, decarbonization pathways, the types of carbon costs they face. Is it scope 1? Is it scope 2 energy related? Is it even not scope 2 related, but related to the pass-through of carbon costs in the electricity price, even if they have zero carbon electricity, like many aluminum smelters, and so on and so forth? It's really hard to have like one size fits all silver bullet solution. But at the same time, you don't necessarily want to have 5, 6, 7 different designs. So you have to sort of find one design that tries to compromise and reach a balance between these trade-offs. And there's trade-offs between many other design elements. If you make it more environmentally or economically robust, with economically, I mean how it ensures that there's no leakage, that there's no competitive disadvantage, it is typically technically more difficult, politically probably more controversial, and also legally riskier. If you make a very soft thing, it may be more viable, but then it doesn't achieve its objectives as well. And so just a few examples, for instance, dealing with exports, very risky to try to sort of rebate the carbon price facing European producers for exports so that they can compete in foreign markets. Yet it's being demanded politically. But again, WTO law will not take that easily, and other countries will probably challenge it. The downstream impacts and substitution effects, depending on where you cut off the threshold. A good example is if you have European aluminum producers, and we include them in this border carbon adjustment, so that foreign aluminum in its basic forms, in its unfinished, like ingots and wire and so on, in its semi-finished forms, are subject to this European carbon price. But you don't include, for instance, the aluminum window frame manufacturers, you may just suddenly have competition further down the value chain, that now Europeans import foreign window frames because those do not have the carbon price included. Resource shuffling is another important challenge. For instance, China produces a lot of aluminum, several times more than the entire EU, but one province alone in China, and this aluminum is typically 2 to 3 times as carbon intensive as European aluminum, but one province in China alone along the Three Gorges Dam produces very clean aluminum because it uses renewable energy. And that could completely meet the entire demand of the EU of Chinese aluminum. So you could easily imagine that, well, if China suddenly faces this carbon border adjustment mechanism, they would just say, well, we start only selling aluminum with 0 carbon emissions because of renewable electricity from that province, and we keep all the other aluminum for ourselves or third markets, and other evasion tactics like transshipment. And finally, this question that I mentioned already, how do we take into account the decarbonization efforts of other countries and producers, and how do we credit that to remain, among other things, in compliance with WTO law? So I'm pretty much up with my 20 minutes. I'll put up this one slide at the end. There's further reading material. I don't know for sure whether the slides will be made available, but there you can find further reading if you want to dive more deeply. And of course, in the discussion, I'm happy to also discuss these issues. Thank you.
And thank you, Michael, for that very detailed, very enlightening presentation. I think you added not only to the number of acronyms I know, but also to the number of questions around this area. Now, Franziska, you would like to maybe respond, discuss, and react to these presentations.
Perfect. Thanks a lot, Daniel, and thank you for having me. It's really a pleasure. Just going to share my screen. So, all right, I have the privilege now to engage with what Ian Parry and Michael Mehling have presented so far, and I will also give you 2 additional perspectives on 2 points which I think will matter a great deal for the future of carbon pricing in the European Union. So from what we've heard so far from the 2 previous speakers, carbon pricing has great potential, but we really need to ramp it up. We have to make it more ambitious so that carbon prices are in line with what is required in order to meet the Paris Agreement, and we need to bring more sectors and more jurisdictions under a carbon price. It's also important to note that what you have been presented with so far are highly efficient instruments for doing so. At the international level, the carbon price floor, which is essentially a minimum standard for a global carbon price, and carbon border adjustments by the EU, which ideally in what I think Michael did not call attention to now, but which the report that he presented does, comes in different scenarios. And what they describe there as the go-getter scenario would be ideal in having essentially a level playing field where you do not have these benchmarks, but you look at the real and actual emissions of the goods that are being adjusted for under the carbon border adjustment. In the 2 previous presentations, however, you've also had a few words of warning already. The perfect carbon border adjustment may not be attainable because there are a lot of legal and political complications coming in. And as Ian has mentioned as well, more generally, carbon prices often need to be accompanied by other instruments in order to make them politically feasible. And now it is exactly that question of political feasibility that I want to draw attention to today, because an efficient carbon price is of no use if it cannot be implemented in practice. And political feasibility is especially important for a time-sensitive problem such as climate change, where we have costs of delay attached to unambitious climate policies. If we do not mitigate now, the costs of mitigation in the future will become much more expensive. So that makes this question, is there maybe a need for a plan B in case that these highly efficient instruments are actually not available? And that doesn't necessarily mean turning the back to carbon pricing. It may just mean that we need a few design tweaks and a few similar but still alternative instruments that could be implemented here. So I want to address in this context 2 challenges for the future of European carbon pricing. One being the possible extension of the EU ETS to previously excluded sectors. In June, we have new information coming on that with the revision of the EU ETS. and a few sectors are not included right now. And the second challenge that I want to draw attention to is to get citizens on board with increasing carbon prices, because they have to increase in the future in order to be in line with the Paris Agreement. So the challenge of hard to decarbonize sectors can be exemplified with agriculture. Agriculture is currently not included in the EU ETS. And it might well be because there are a couple of sectoral difficulties that make agriculture quite special and a little difficult to include there. So the economic entities are much smaller than in other sectors, which makes monitoring and transaction costs higher. Then there are also, like in other sectors, concerns over international competitiveness and leakage. And of course, the farming lobby might oppose measures like being added under the EU ETS on such concerns and such grounds. And then there's also the concern that production side mitigation may actually be limited in this sector. In other sectors, we can be quite sure that with 100% carbon-free electrification, we can get very close to net zero, while in agriculture, there are land use change emissions or methane emissions, for example, from ruminants, where it's not necessarily clear how you decarbonize them in a net zero scenario, and whether it doesn't also need demand adjustments in order to move away from goods that are especially carbon intensive. So one such good is definitely livestock. In the European Union, roughly 42% of agriculture emissions relate to livestock. And that might prompt the question whether a plan B for when the inclusion of the agriculture sector in the EU ETS unattainable might not be consumption taxes on animal-based products. Such consumption taxes on meat and dairy, for example, which are quite high-emitting goods, could reduce meat demand and generate revenues at the same time, which then again could be used for further spending on mitigation and other measures. They're also a quick fix for competitiveness concerns and leakage concerns in case there's no carbon border adjustment in place, because these taxes can be levied on imports and exports can also be exempted from such kind of taxes. However, they come with one disadvantage, which is that because you would have to do some sort of benchmarking as well, there are probably no incentives for efficiency gains on the production side. So farmers will not be incentivized much to change their farming methods. And there might be a need for additional instruments because of that. All right, so for that as an alternative, if for political economy reasons, carbon border adjustments or similar policies are not available, I want to draw your attention to the second challenge, which I feel is very important in the context of the European Union, which is getting citizens behind increasing carbon prices. So one of the features of carbon pricing is that they are usually regressive, which means that they impact low-income households much more because they spend a larger share of their income on especially carbon-intensive goods such as electricity. And some survey-based studies of researchers that dealt with public support of carbon pricing have found that in a couple of European countries, citizens really display a form of tax aversion, as here notably in France, and which has even been brought into connection with the Yellow Vest movement, which has taken issue with carbon prices, although that was, of course, not the main or not the singular reason of it. So it's not quite clear what is behind the tax aversion, but there are several hypotheses and several findings. There might be a lack of understanding what carbon pricing is all about and that it is really effective in reducing emissions. The respondents to these surveys have usually had doubts about the effectiveness and have classified it as much less effective than studies have shown it would be. Costs are highly visible in comparison to other policies such as standards, where it's not really clear what is the carbon price that would be associated with it, what does it cost citizens when you think about final consumer goods. Then there are, of course, also fairness concerns. As I already mentioned, carbon prices are regressive and especially affected groups such as people who commute on a daily basis might take issue with that. And finally, and that's something where I want to do much more research in the future is that citizens have specific identities and worldviews that might interact with their public support of climate policies, such as an attitude where there's skepticism of state intervention that could play into this as well. To date, little is known about how the public perceives emissions trading, so the emissions trading system in the EU. Some scholars have suggested that in the end it is probably much more technocratic and does not attract so much interest as carbon taxes, as taxes are a policy that citizens are much more familiar with, but there might be some of the similar difficulties in terms of public support here. Okay, one thing that the literature here has identified as one possible fix is using the revenues that carbon pricing creates in order to redistribute them back to citizens, or in order to finance something that enhances the public support that citizens have for carbon pricing policies. So the first strategy here would be green spending, basically reinvesting the carbon pricing revenues into other green investment. And this has been shown to especially enhance the image of environmental effectiveness, mostly with people who already have pro-environmentalist attitudes. However, for that measure to work, there's also trust in government required. It mostly works on people who already have a good trust that this money will be put to good use by the government. The other strategy is redistributing it back to citizens, giving the money back to citizens. And this can come in different shapes and forms. It can come in as a fee and dividend approach where every citizen gets the same amount of money back. It can come in the form of targeted transfers, either to low-income groups or to especially affected groups in society, as Germany has done with their domestic carbon price. They've put large parts of it into a commuter allowance to ease the burden on people who commute on a regular basis. So for the first two strategies here, we know that they will definitely benefit lower-income households. The third one is not so clear and has to be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. So to maybe give a quick summary for what this might mean in the context of the EU and the future of carbon pricing there. Green spending, these studies have shown, the study in the context of Germany, may risk preaching to the choir, as in the end, a lot of people would be enticed by it that already support such measures because they are having pre-environmental attitudes. And on the other hand, redistribution and targeted transfers are a strategy that are especially popular among people who would rather oppose policies in the first place. The other finding has been that as carbon prices grow, the redistribution motive is becoming much more expensive. And people do not care as much about green spending anymore as they do about having the burden on themselves eased. So that could be a viable strategy in order to make carbon pricing more popular with citizens in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Franziska, so much for bringing us also back to these political economy issues. And again, as the other speakers have said, how carbon pricing relates to other policies, other elements that we also need to take account in order to have something really viable and effective. We have a few questions now.